The Awakening. Alice Martinez stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her small apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. One moment she'd been watching Mystery Science Theater 3000, curled up on her couch in her favorite pajamas, and the next she found herself standing on an alien mesa wearing a sleek black bodysuit that seemed to adjust to her every movement. Now, 3 weeks later, she could tear apart metal with her bare hands. Time for final preparations, she muttered to herself, adjusting the silvery suit that had replaced their initial black ones. The material seemed to pulse with energy, responding to her thoughts almost as readily as her own muscles did. She'd gotten used to the way it enhanced her already superhuman abilities, but it still felt surreal. The ship's observation deck offered a panoramic view of Bahit 7, the desert planet below them. Somewhere on that dusty sphere was the research facility where everything had gone wrong. Where Arox, their alien mentor, had accidentally attracted something from beyond the boundaries of their universe, something that was now threatening to devour everything in its path. Walt and Natasha were already on the deck when she arrived, both looking grim but determined. Walt had traded his usual sardonic smile for a focused frown, while Natasha was doing her pre-mission stretches with mechanical precision. Scott arrived last, his normally unruly mop of curls somewhat tamed by the suit's hood. "The target area has grown significantly," Arox announced, his scaled blue fingers dancing over holographic displays. The alien researcher looked haggard, his emerald eyes dulled by exhaustion. "The entity has consumed approximately 17% of my former research facility and the surrounding area. At current rates of expansion, it will devour the entire planet within a year." "Just how big is this thing now?" Walt asked, his sales pitch confidence notably absent. Arox pulled up a three-dimensional map. "The main mass occupies roughly 3 square kilometers, but its influence extends much further. We've detected anomalies up to 50 kilometers from the epicenter." Alice studied the readings. She'd learned enough of the alien script over the past weeks to make sense of the basic measurements. "Those energy signatures, they're similar to the ones you showed us during training." "The dimensional boundary interference patterns?" "Correct," Arox nodded. "The entity is still mostly anchored in its own dimension, but it's pushing through more of itself every day. The barrier between realities is growing dangerously thin in this region." "So what's the actual plan?" Scott asked, nervously adjusting his glasses, the one piece of Earth equipment they'd all insisted on keeping. "We can't just punch an interdimensional horror in the face." "Can we?" Natasha cracked her knuckles. "Why not? We have power now. Real power." "It's not that simple," Arox said, bringing up more detailed scans. "The entity has already absorbed several of my former security teams. Their weapons, their armor, even their ships, all became part of its mass. But you humans, your abilities operate on a fundamentally different level. You don't just use energy from our universe, you can channel power from other dimensions. That's what makes you dangerous. That's what makes you our only hope." Alice remembered the first time she'd accessed that power. During training, she'd reached for something beyond herself, something vast and ancient that seemed to permeate everything. When she touched it, reality itself had bent to her will. The training dummy hadn't just exploded, it had ceased to exist in their dimension entirely. "We'll need to strike at its core," Arox continued. "My reading suggests there's a central nexus where the entity first pushed through. If we can damage it there, we might force it to retreat." "And if we can't?" Walt asked. Arox's scaled face grew even more serious. "Then it will continue to grow. Eventually, it will consume this planet, then spread to others. Your Earth would not be spared. The suppression field that keeps humanity's powers dormant wouldn't stop it." The 4 humans exchanged looks. They'd come a long way from their initial skepticism. 3 weeks of intensive training had transformed them from ordinary people into something else entirely. Alice could feel the power humming beneath her skin, waiting to be unleashed. Walt could move objects with his mind that would require industrial equipment to budge. Scott could channel pure dimensional energy in devastating bolts. And Natasha. Natasha had become something truly frightening, her physical abilities exceeding even Arox's wildest expectations. We should review the approach one more time, Alice suggested, pushing away her doubts. Scott's energy attacks seem most effective at disrupting the entity's dimensional barriers. He'll need to clear a path. I can maintain a shield around us, Walt added. At least for a while. The telekinetic barrier should buy us some time if things get messy. I'll take point, Natasha said firmly. Nothing we've encountered in training can match my speed now. I can scout ahead, identify threats before they reach us. Alice nodded. And I'll focus on molecular manipulation. If we encounter any of its absorbed technology, I might be able to tear it apart or repurpose it. A sound strategy, Arox approved. But be warned, the entity is intelligent. It learns, adapts. Everything it absorbs adds to its knowledge. And it's had weeks to study the remains of my facility. The alien researcher moved to a different console, bringing up images of the facility's original layout. We'll land here, 2 kilometers from the edge of its influence. Any closer and we risk immediate detection. The central nexus should be located in what was once my primary research chamber, here. He indicated a point deep within the corrupted zone. That's a long way through hostile territory, Scott observed. We don't have a choice, Alice said. If we don't stop it here. Earth, Walt finished grimly. Yeah, I get it. 2 briefcases of gold won't mean much if the planet gets eaten by an interdimensional horror. Speaking of payment, Arox interjected, I've prepared something additional. If we succeed, if you survive, I have data crystals containing information about human abilities. Research my people conducted before implementing the suppression field. It won't tell you how to disable the field, but it might help you understand your powers better, maybe even retain some of them when you return. Assuming we don't all get absorbed into a flesh horror, Scott muttered. Focus, Natasha snapped. We train for weeks. We become stronger than any human in history. Now we use this strength. Alice touched the silvery material of her suit again, drawing comfort from its responsive nature. Natasha's right. Whatever happens down there, we're humanity's best shot. Maybe our only shot. Arox's ship began its descent through Bahit 7's atmosphere, the hull barely shuddering despite the turbulence. Through the observation windows, Alice could see the distant smear of wrongness that marked the entity's territory. Even from this height, something about it felt fundamentally wrong, like a corruption in the fabric of reality itself. Final equipment check, Walt announced, falling back on his training. Suits at full power, neural links active, emergency beacons primed. They went through the checklist methodically, each of them knowing this might be their last chance to ensure everything was perfect. The suits were marvels of alien engineering, designed to enhance and channel their newly awakened abilities. Each one had been calibrated specifically to its wearer over the past weeks, becoming almost a second skin. Remember your training, Arox said as the ship touched down on the desert surface. Remember what you've learned about your powers, about yourselves. You're no longer just humans, you're living proof of why the galaxy feared your species enough to suppress it in the first place. The ship's main hatch began to open, letting in the hot, dry air of Bahit 7. In the distance, the entity's domain pulsed with sickly colors that shouldn't exist in nature. Alice took a deep breath, feeling the familiar surge of power within her. She thought about her small apartment back on Earth, about her job at the local library, about all the science fiction she'd read that hadn't prepared her for the reality of becoming something more than human. Let's go save the universe, she said, stepping toward the hatch. Or at least give it one hell of a fight. The others fell in behind her, each of them charged with power that would have seemed impossible mere weeks ago. As they began their trek across the desert surface, Alice couldn't help but wonder if this was how humanity was meant to be all along, not bound by the suppression field, but free to reach their true potential. The entity waited ahead, a horror from beyond their universe. But they weren't ordinary humans anymore. They were something the galaxy had feared for millennia. And they were about to show exactly why. First contact. The desert of Bahit 7 stretched before them like an endless sea of golden dust, broken only by the twisted anomaly that marked their destination. As they approached the edge of the entity's influence, the very air seemed to change, becoming thick with an invisible tension that made their enhanced senses tingle with warning. Movement at 2 o'clock, Natasha reported, her augmented reflexes allowing her to track subtle disturbances in the distance. Something's shifting under the surface. Walt raised his hands, a shimming telekinetic barrier forming around the group. I don't like this. The readings are all wrong. It's like the laws of physics are breaking down the closer we get. Alice understood what he meant. Her power to manipulate molecules was giving her increasingly strange feedback, as if the very structure of matter was becoming uncertain. Scott, what are you getting? Scott's hands crackled with dimensional energy as he took readings of his own. The barrier between realities is like Swiss cheese out here. I'm picking up echoes from at least 3 different dimensional frequencies, maybe more. Stay focused, Alice reminded them. Arox said the entity would try to confuse us, distract us. Whatever we see, whatever we feel, we stick to the plan. They crossed an invisible threshold, and suddenly the landscape changed. The golden sand gave way to something that resembled flesh, if flesh could be metallic and geometric at the same time. Fragments of Arox's research facility protruded from the mass like bones from an open wound, twisted and reformed into impossible shapes. Those were quantum containment chambers, Scott said, pointing to a cluster of deformed structures. Look at the residual energy patterns. Whatever this thing is, it's not just absorbing matter, it's learning from it. A sound like distant thunder rolled across the corrupted landscape, but the sky above remained clear. The entity was aware of them now, responding to their presence in ways they couldn't fully comprehend. Natasha, scout ahead, Alice commanded. But don't engage. We need to know what we're dealing with. The former MMA fighter nodded and burst into motion, her enhanced speed carrying her across the twisted terrain in mere seconds. She returned just as quickly, her face grim. There are things moving out there. Parts of the facility, parts of the security teams, all merged together. They're like antibodies in a body, protecting the main mass. Can we go around them? Walt asked, adjusting his barrier as strange energies began to probe at its edges. Negative, Natasha replied. They're everywhere, and they're coordinated. This thing might be alien, but it's definitely intelligent. Scott's energy readings suddenly spiked. Incoming. The first attack came not from any physical direction, but from reality itself. The space around them seemed to fold, trying to engulf them in dimensional distortions that would have torn normal matter apart. Walt's barrier flared brilliant blue as it repelled the assault, but the strain showed on his face. Scott, clear us a path. Alice shouted. Natasha, be ready to move. Scott unleashed his power, sending bolts of pure dimensional energy into the writhing mass before them. Where his attack struck, reality briefly stabilized, creating temporary safe zones in the chaos. Natasha exploded into action, her superhuman strength and speed allowing her to literally punch through the smaller entities that tried to block their way. Alice focused on the corrupted facility components, using her molecular manipulation to break down anything that might pose a threat. It was harder than any training exercise, the matter here didn't want to obey normal physical laws, fighting her control at every turn. The nexus is still 2 kilometers in, Walt ground out, maintaining the barrier despite increasing pressure. We need to move faster. A new sound cut through the chaos, something between a scream and the rending of metal. From the twisted landscape rose a figure that made them all stop short. It had clearly once been one of Arox's security team, but the entity had reformed it into something nightmarish. Alien armor and flesh had been fused with pieces of the facility, creating a towering amalgamation that radiated wrongness. "Well," Scott said, his voice shaking slightly, "I guess we know what happened to the previous response team." The creature moved with impossible fluidity for its size, and more were emerging behind it. Each one was unique in its horror, shaped by whatever materials and beings had been absorbed to create it. They were like antibodies, just as Natasha had said, the entity's immune system responding to their intrusion. "New plan," Alice announced, drawing on every bit of power she could muster. "We go through them. Hard and fast. Scott, disrupt their dimensional stability. Walt, keep the barrier focused forward like a wedge. Natasha. I break things," the fighter grinned, dropping into a combat stance. "And I'll try to turn their own mass against them," Alice finished. "Ready?" They moved as one, their weeks of training paying off as they functioned like a single unit. Scott's energy blasts created gaps in the entity's control, making its creations vulnerable to normal physics again. Walt's barrier took on the shape of an arrowhead, deflecting attacks while allowing them to push forward. Natasha became a blur of devastating strikes, her enhanced strength allowing her to shatter even the largest amalgamations. Alice reached out with her power, finding the places where normal matter still existed within the corrupted forms. She couldn't affect everything, some components were too far gone, operating on physics from other dimensions, but she could create weak points, structural failures that her teammates could exploit. They fought their way forward meter by meter, but the entity was learning, adapting. Each new wave of defenders was more resistant to their powers, forcing them to expend more energy just to maintain their position. "The Nexus is resonating with our attacks," Scott reported between energy blasts. "It knows we're coming for it. It's trying to strengthen the dimensional barriers around its core." "Then we'd better get there before it succeeds," Walt growled, his barrier flickering as something massive slammed into it. A particularly large amalgamation burst from the ground directly in their path. This one appeared to have been created from multiple security team members, their forms twisted together with what might have been a spacecraft. It moved with frightening coordination, as if guided by multiple minds working in perfect sync. "I've got this," Natasha declared, launching herself at the monstrosity. Her first strike staggered it, but it recovered quickly, revealing an ability to match her enhanced speed. The two traded blows that would have shattered normal matter, their battle becoming a blur of motion too fast for even their enhanced senses to fully track. "She needs help," Scott said, trying to line up a shot without risking hitting Natasha. "Focus on the others," Alice ordered, watching more defenders approach. "She can handle herself. We need to dash." Her words cut off as a new sensation washed over them. The very ground beneath their feet began to shift, the entity attempting to absorb them directly into its mass. Walt's barrier barely extended in time, creating a small island of stable reality in the chaos. "We can't stay here," he warned, sweat beading on his forehead. "Whatever this thing is, it's not just trying to kill us anymore. It wants to add us to itself." Alice watched as Natasha finally gained the upper hand against the massive amalgamation, literally tearing it apart with her bare hands. But even as it fell, its components were being reabsorbed into the entity's mass, ready to be reshaped into new defenders. Change of strategy, she decided. "We're not getting to the Nexus like this. Scott, how much power can you channel at once? Without burning myself out?" "Maybe 3 times what I'm doing now." "Why?" "Because we're going to need a bigger hole." Alice turned to Walt. "Can you shape your barrier into a sphere? Something that can protect us from all sides?" The former salesman nodded grimly. "For a little while, yeah. But it'll drain me faster." "Natasha!" Alice called. "Fall back. We're going to try something new." The fighter disengaged from her battle, covering the distance back to them in milliseconds. "This better be good. These things are getting stronger." "It will be," Alice assured her. "But I need you to be ready to run faster than you've ever run before." The entity seemed to sense them planning, as the attack suddenly intensified. Walt's barrier trembled under impacts from a dozen directions at once. But Alice could see something the entity couldn't, a pattern in the chaos, a way to use its own nature against it. Here's what we're going to do. The entity had changed the rules of reality itself. But that didn't mean they couldn't change them right back. The breaking point. Everyone clear on the plan? Alice asked, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Walt's barrier flickered with constant impacts as the entity's defenders grew more aggressive. Clear as dimensional mud, Scott replied, his hands already beginning to glow with gathered power. But it beats getting absorbed. The plan was desperate, perhaps even reckless, but it was built on a crucial observation. The entity wasn't just consuming and reshaping matter, it was establishing its own laws of physics, expanding its reality into their universe. But that process wasn't instantaneous or complete. There were still boundaries, places where its influence wavered. Walt, on my mark, reshape the barrier into a spear, Alice instructed. Scott, channel everything you've got into disrupting the dimensional frequency directly ahead. Natasha, you're our battering ram. The fighter grinned, her entire body beginning to vibrate with barely contained power. The entity had shown them that speed and strength weren't enough on their own. But combined with their other abilities, properly focused. Now. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. Walt's barrier transformed from a protective dome into a piercing wedge of pure force. Scott unleashed a blast of dimensional energy that momentarily forced reality itself to stabilize along a narrow corridor. And Natasha, moving faster than even her enhanced reflexes should have allowed, grabbed Alice and Walt while Scott held onto her shoulder. They became a human missile, Natasha's speed combined with Walt's telekinetic spear and Scott's reality-stabilizing energy. Alice reached out with her molecular manipulation, not to attack, but to analyze. She could feel the patterns of corruption, the places where normal physics still held sway. The entity's defenders tried to intercept them, but they were moving too fast, their combined powers creating a perfect storm of force and dimensional manipulation. They pierced through the outer layers of corruption like a needle through fabric. Then everything went wrong. The entity had been waiting for them to try something like this. As they penetrated deeper into its territory, the very concepts of space and distance began to break down. What looked like meters became kilometers, and simple straight lines twisted into impossible geometries. It's a trap. Scott shouted, his energy flickering as it encountered frequencies he'd never sensed before. The dimensional barriers, they're not just random corruption. They're structured. Alice felt it too. The entity wasn't just powerful, it was methodical. Every aspect of its expansion had been carefully planned, creating a layered defense that was now closing around them like a fist. Walt, expand the barrier, she commanded. Full sphere, now. The telekinetic barrier bloomed outward just as reality itself seemed to collapse inward. They found themselves in a space that shouldn't exist, a bubble of normal physics surrounded by a maelstrom of dimensional chaos. Well, Walt said through gritted teeth, I guess we found out why its previous victims couldn't stop it. This thing isn't just strong. It's smart. Natasha paced the confines of their protective bubble like a caged tiger. So we hit it harder. We break through. No, Alice said quietly, her mind racing as she processed what she was sensing. We've been thinking about this all wrong. The entity isn't just trying to consume our universe. It's trying to merge them. Create a space where both sets of physics can coexist. Scott's eyes widened behind his glasses. That's why it absorbed Aerox's research team. It needed to understand our universe's laws before it could begin the merger. A sound like crystal breaking echoed through their bubble of safety. Cracks began to appear in the very fabric of space around them, revealing glimpses of something else. Not the twisted landscape they'd been fighting through, but something far stranger. I'm losing the barrier, Walt warned, his face pale with strain. Whatever's out there, it's not just attacking the field anymore. It's changing the rules that make it work. Alice closed her eyes, reaching out with her power in a different way. Instead of trying to manipulate the molecules around them, she tried to feel the patterns of their flow, the underlying structure of reality itself. What she found nearly broke her mind. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Terrible, but beautiful. The entity, it's not trying to destroy our universe. It's trying to elevate it. Make it part of something larger." "That's great," Natasha snapped, "but it's still going to kill everyone in the process." The barrier cracked further, and through the gaps, Alice caught glimpses of what looked like vast geometric shapes moving with organic fluidity. The entity's true form, existing in dimensions they could barely comprehend. "Our powers," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. "They're not just abilities. They're proof that humans can naturally interact with other dimensions. That's why the galaxy feared us. That's why they suppressed us. We're not just terminals, we're bridges." Scott's energy flared as he caught on to her meaning. "You're saying we can do what the entity is doing? Create a controlled merger of realities?" "Not exactly," Alice said. "But maybe we can speak its language. Communicate with it directly." Walt laughed despite their dire situation. "Great. Let's have a nice chat with the interdimensional horror about its plans for universal gentrification." The barrier shattered. Reality rushed in like a flood, but instead of fighting it, Alice opened herself to it completely. She felt her consciousness expand, touching levels of existence she'd never imagined. The others followed her lead, their powers intertwining in ways their training had never prepared them for. In that moment of dimensional synchronization, Alice understood what Erox had never fully grasped. The entity wasn't their enemy, it was a natural force, like gravity or entropy, trying to fulfill its purpose. But that purpose would destroy everything they knew and loved. "Show me," she whispered to the chaos around them. "Show me what you're trying to create." The entity responded. Images flooded their enhanced minds, universes interlinked like strands of DNA, realities flowing into each other in endless cycles of creation and transformation. It was a vision of existence beyond anything human philosophy had imagined, beautiful and horrifying in its complexity. But there was something wrong with the pattern. The entity's method of merger was too brutal, too fast. It was trying to force evolution that should take eons to unfold naturally. "We have to stop it," Alice said, her voice distant as she processed what she'd seen. "Not because it's evil, but because it's too eager. Too hungry." "How?" Scott asked, his own consciousness expanded by the dimensional contact. "We can't fight it conventionally." "We don't fight it," Alice replied. "We redirect it. Channel it. Like a river that's flooding. We don't try to stop the water, we guide it to where it can do less harm." Natasha's enhanced physical powers had taken on a new dimension, her body becoming a conductor for forces they barely understood. "You want to show an interdimensional entity better manners? While it's trying to eat us?" "No," Alice said. "I want to show it there's a better way to achieve its goal. One that doesn't involve destroying everything in its path." Walt's telekinetic powers had evolved as well, allowing him to grip reality itself rather than just physical objects. "And how exactly do we do that?" Alice looked at her teammates, seeing how their powers had grown and changed through this extreme exposure. They were becoming something new, something that might finally bridge the gap between ordinary humans and their true potential. "We show it what humanity can really do," she said. "Why the galaxy was right to fear us. Not because we're destructive, but because we can adapt. We can change. We can become what we need to be." The entity's presence pressed against their minds, curious now rather than hostile. It had never encountered beings that could perceive it so directly, let alone communicate with it. "But first," Alice added, "we need to survive what's about to happen." The space around them began to shift again, but this time it wasn't an attack. The entity was responding to their revelation, changing its approach. Whether that change would help or destroy them remained to be seen. Their powers were evolving, but they were also reaching their limits. If they couldn't find a way to resolve this confrontation soon, there wouldn't be enough of their original selves left to return home. The true test was about to begin. Evolution's edge. The human mind wasn't meant to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Even with their enhanced abilities, Alice could feel her consciousness straining at the edges, trying to process realities that defied comprehension. Around her, her teammates were experiencing similar challenges. Status report, she managed, her voice sounding strange even to herself. I can barely tell which way is up anymore, Scott replied, his energy now flowing in patterns that seemed to ignore conventional physics. But I think I'm starting to understand how this thing perceives our universe. Walt's telekinetic abilities had expanded to the point where he was manipulating dimensional forces rather than physical objects, but the strain was showing. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it fast. I don't think our bodies can handle much more of this exposure. Natasha's enhanced physical abilities had evolved into something almost mythical, her movements now seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, as if she was quantum boxing with reality itself. Speak for yourself. This feels right somehow. Alice understood what she meant. Despite the strain, despite the danger, there was something familiar about this state. As if humanity had always had this potential, locked away behind the suppression field and their own limited understanding. The entity continued to surround them, its vast consciousness pressing against their expanded awareness. It was curious now, studying them as they studied it. Through their enhanced perception, they could see how it had been reshaping Arox's research facility, not destroying it, but transforming it into something that could exist in multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Look at the pattern, Alice said suddenly, focusing on a particular aspect of the entity's structure. It's not random. It's following a specific sequence, like DNA replication, but for reality itself. Scott adjusted his glasses, a strangely human gesture given their current state. You're right. It's trying to create a stable merger between dimensions, but it's going about it all wrong. The process is too aggressive, too rapid. Can we show it a better way? Walt asked, his voice strained. Because my head feels like it's about to explode, and I'd really like to get back to selling furniture sometime this century. Alice reached out with her evolved molecular manipulation, not to attack or defend, but to understand. The entity's method of transformation was fascinating. It wasn't just changing matter, it was changing the underlying rules that governed how matter behaved. We need to synchronize, she decided. Not fight it, not redirect it, but work with it. Show it how to achieve its goal without destroying everything in the process. And how exactly do we do that? Natasha asked, her form flickering between states of motion. Together, Alice replied. The same way we've been training. But instead of combining our powers to fight, we combine them to create. The entity's presence shifted, showing interest in their intent. It had never encountered beings that could perceive its work so directly, let alone suggest alternatives. Scott, you understand dimensional energy better than any of us now, Alice continued. You'll be our foundation. Create a stable framework that bridges our reality with the entities. Scott nodded, his power beginning to pulse in complex patterns. I think, yes, I can see how to do it. Like creating a translation matrix between different languages. Walt, you'll be our anchor. Use your abilities to maintain our connection to normal spacetime. Keep us from getting lost in the dimensional flux. Great, Walt muttered. More pressure. Just what I needed. Natasha, your evolved abilities let you exist in multiple states at once. You'll be our conductor, helping us synchronize our powers with the entity's transformative energy. The fighter grinned, her form becoming even more fluid. Finally, all those yoga classes pay off. And I'll try to guide the actual transformation process, Alice finished. Show it how to achieve merger without destruction. They moved together, their powers intertwining in ways that would have been impossible just hours ago. Scott created a lattice of dimensional energy, carefully structured to allow controlled interaction between realities. Walt anchored them to their home dimension while simultaneously allowing them to reach into others. Natasha's quantum state helped them match the entity's rhythms, while Alice began the delicate process of demonstrating controlled transformation. The entity responded, its vast consciousness focusing on their effort. Through their enhanced perception, they could sense its surprise, its interest. This was new to it, the idea that transformation could be gentle, guided, evolutionary rather than revolutionary. For a moment, it seemed to be working. The chaotic energies around them began to stabilize, forming patterns that were complex but not destructive. The entity was learning, adapting its approach. Then something went wrong. The dimensional barriers began to fluctuate wildly, as if some fundamental force had been disturbed. The entity's presence became agitated, its patterns shifting faster than they could track. Something's happening. Scott shouted, his energy framework starting to crack. The dimensional frequencies are going crazy. It's not just us here, Alice realized with sudden clarity. There's something else. Something the entity was trying to. Before she could finish, reality seemed to tear open around them. Through the breach, they caught glimpses of something vast and dark, something that made the entity seem simple by comparison. Oh hell, Walt managed. Please tell me that's not what I think it is. The entity wasn't trying to merge realities, Alice said, her enhanced perception finally understanding the truth. It was trying to escape. And now we've accidentally helped it make a hole big enough for its pursuer to follow. Through their dimensional awareness, they could feel the entity's fear. Whatever was coming through that breach was ancient, patient, and utterly incomprehensible to their human minds. New plan? Natasha asked, her quantum state flickering as the dimensional distortions intensified. Alice looked at her teammates, seeing the strain of their evolved powers etched on their faces. They were reaching their limits, pushing the boundaries of what even enhanced humans could endure. But they couldn't stop now, not with something worse than the entity about to enter their reality. New plan, she confirmed. We help the entity. Not because we trust it, but because whatever's chasing it is so much worse. Help it how? Scott asked, struggling to maintain their dimensional framework. By showing it something else it's never seen before, Alice said. The true reason humanity was feared across the galaxy. Not just our ability to interact with other dimensions, but our ability to change the rules entirely. The entity's presence pressed against their minds, desperate now rather than curious. Through their connection, Alice could sense that it had been running for a very, very long time. Well, humanity had a long history of helping refugees. Even interdimensional ones. They just had to survive what was coming through that breach first. Breaking the rules. The dimensional breach hung in space like a wound in reality itself, dark energies seeping through as something vast and ancient began to push its way into their universe. The entity's fear was palpable now, its presence drawing closer to the four humans as if seeking protection. Okay, Walt said, his voice strained as he struggled to maintain their dimensional anchor, I'm starting to think maybe we weren't supposed to be the galaxy's greatest threat after all. No, Alice replied, her enhanced perception taking in the full scope of what was emerging. We weren't. But that doesn't mean we can't change the rules of the game. Through their evolved powers, they could sense the true nature of what was pursuing the entity. It wasn't just ancient, it was a fundamental force of reality itself, something that maintained order by eliminating anything that threatened to disturb the careful balance between dimensions. It's like an interdimensional immune system, Scott realized, his energy framework adapting to accommodate his understanding. And the entity is like a virus, trying to merge realities in ways they're not supposed to merge. So what does that make us? Natasha asked, her quantum state becoming increasingly unstable as the dimensional distortions intensified. The wild card, Alice said. Something neither of them expected. Humanity wasn't suppressed just because we could interact with other dimensions, we were suppressed because we can change how that interaction works. The entity's presence pulsed with desperate energy, trying to communicate something through their connection. Images flooded their enhanced minds, countless realities, each one carefully separated from the others, maintained by the ancient force that was now breaking through into their universe. "It's showing us its history," Scott said. "It's been trying to merge realities because it thinks isolation is wrong. That different dimensions should be able to interact, to grow together." "Noble goal," Walt grunted, "terrible execution." Alice focused on the patterns she was seeing, understanding at last what made humanity so special. "We're not bound by the same rules. Our powers don't just let us work with dimensional energy, they let us redefine how that energy behaves." The breach widened, and something began to emerge. It defied description, existing in so many dimensions simultaneously that even their enhanced perception could only grasp fragments of its true form. But its purpose was clear: maintain separation, enforce isolation, preserve the boundaries between realities at any cost. "I have an idea," Alice said suddenly. "But it's either brilliant or completely insane." "Those are the best kind," Natasha replied, her form flickering between states as she prepared for whatever came next. "Scott, you remember how we synchronized with the entity? How we showed it a gentler way to merge realities? Yeah, right before we accidentally helped it punch a hole big enough for cosmic horror to follow it through. We need to do it again," Alice continued. "But this time, we're not just going to show it a better way to merge realities. We're going to show both of them a completely new way for dimensions to interact." Understanding dawned in Scott's eyes. "You want to create a new set of rules. Something that allows for connection without merger, interaction without destruction." "Exactly. Walt, can you expand your anchor to include the entity? Make it part of our dimensional framework?" The former salesman laughed despite the strain. "Sure, why not? We're only trying to rewrite the laws of reality. What could go wrong? Natasha, your quantum state is perfect for this. You'll be our proof of concept, showing how something can exist in multiple states without losing its identity." The fighter nodded, her form becoming even more fluid. "Ready when you are, boss." The ancient force was almost through now, its presence causing reality itself to tremble. The entity pressed closer to them, its fear mixing with desperate hope as it sensed their intent. "Together," Alice commanded. "Everything we've got. Every bit of power, every ounce of potential. We're going to show them why humanity was worth fearing, not because we're destructive, but because we can create something entirely new." They moved as one, their evolved powers combining in ways that transcended their training. Scott's energy framework expanded exponentially, creating a space where different dimensional frequencies could coexist without merging. Walt's anchor stabilized this new framework, grounding it in fundamental forces while allowing for unprecedented flexibility. Natasha's quantum state demonstrated the possibility of existing in multiple realities simultaneously while maintaining coherence. And Alice, drawing on everything she'd learned about molecular manipulation and dimensional interaction, began to weave it all together into something new. Not a merger of realities, not a rigid separation, but a dynamic balance that allowed for growth and interaction while preserving the unique nature of each dimension. The entity caught on quickly, its vast consciousness adapting to their concept and adding its own understanding. Together, they began to create something that had never existed before, a new set of laws that could govern dimensional interaction. The ancient force paused in its emergence, sensing the change. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, it studied what they were creating. Then, slowly, it began to respond. "It's working!" Scott shouted, his energy framework expanding to accommodate the new patterns. "It's actually considering it." Through their connection, they could feel the ancient force's surprise, its reluctant admiration. In all its eons of maintaining dimensional boundaries, it had never encountered beings who could propose a viable alternative to its rigid system of separation. The entity's fear began to fade, replaced by something like wonder. It had been running for so long, trying to force changes that it didn't fully understand. Now it was seeing a better way, not merger, not isolation, but conscious, controlled interaction. "We need to lock it in," Alice said, her consciousness straining to maintain control of the process. "Make these new rules permanent before either of them changes their mind." "How?" Walt asked, his anchor beginning to falter under the immense pressure. "By doing what humanity does best," Alice replied. "Adapting." They poured everything they had left into one final effort. Their powers, pushed beyond their limits by dimensional exposure, began to change in fundamental ways. They weren't just using energy from other dimensions anymore, they were becoming living bridges between realities, examples of how conscious beings could exist in multiple states while maintaining their essential nature. The ancient force finally made its decision. Instead of attacking, it began to work with them, its vast power helping to stabilize the new framework they'd created. The entity followed suit, its transformative abilities now focused on supporting their creation rather than forcing merger. Reality itself seemed to hold its breath as the new rules took hold. Then, slowly, the dimensional breach began to close, not through force or fear, but through mutual understanding. The entity's presence brushed against their minds one last time, sharing feelings of gratitude and respect before it departed to explore existence under the new rules they'd created together. The ancient force withdrew as well, its purpose changed but not ended, now it would maintain balance through cooperation rather than isolation. As their enhanced perception began to fade, Alice looked at her teammates. They were all exhausted, changed in ways they might never fully understand. But they were alive, and they had done something unprecedented, they had shown why humanity's potential was truly worth fearing, and worth preserving. "So," Walt said as they began their long trek back to Erox's ship, "about those briefcases of gold." Natasha laughed, her form finally settling back into normal spacetime. "After what we just did? He should double the payment." "I don't think any of us are going to be quite the same," Scott observed, studying the residual energy that still coursed through them. "No," Alice agreed. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. We just proved that change doesn't have to be destructive. That differences can coexist without conflict. That's a lesson worth learning." As they reached the ship, they found Erox waiting for them, his emerald eyes wide with disbelief as his instruments tried to process what had happened. "I sent you to stop an interdimensional horror," the alien researcher said. "Instead, you rewrote the fundamental laws governing dimensional interaction. The Assembly of Ministers is going to have a collective meltdown." "That's not all," Alice said with a small smile. "I think we just proved that the suppression field around Earth isn't necessary anymore. Not if humanity can learn to use its potential responsibly." "One impossible thing at a time," Erox sighed. But there was hope in his voice, and perhaps a touch of pride. They had saved far more than just their universe today. They had created something new, something that might eventually unite all of reality in ways neither the entity nor its pursuer had imagined possible. And they had shown the galaxy why humanity was worth believing in, even if it was also worth fearing. Not bad for a librarian, a furniture salesman, a college student, and an MMA fighter. Not bad at all. The end.